This is from the book by James Dunn, um, Christology in the Making. And this is under the headline Wisdom in Pre-Christian Judaism on page 168. What or who was this wisdom whose descriptions and functions are attributed to Christ in such a broad sweep of New Testament writings? What or who was this wisdom with which, whom, Christ seems to have been identified as early as Paul? Because Paul calls Jesus the wisdom of God. To answer this question, we must inquire into the meaning of the term wisdom in pre-Christian Judaism, in particular in those passages where it is described as pre-existent and having as a role in creation. The key passages here are, and then he quotes Job 28, Proverbs 8, verses 22 to 31, Syriac 24, which is extra canonical, Barak 3, verses 9 to 4, verse 4, that's also extra canonical, the Book of Wisdom, which is also extra canonical, chapter 6, verses 12 to 11, verse 1, and First of Enoch 42, which is also extra canonical, and various references to wisdom in Philo. What or who is wisdom in all these passages? Unfortunately, the answer is not clear, and we find ourselves at this point caught up in a still unresolved debate. The principal options held out to us are as follows. Wisdom is a divine being, an independent deity, as in the near parallels in Egyptian and Mesopotamian religions. The second one is wisdom is a hypostasis, that is a quasi-personification of certain attributes proper to God, occupying an intermediate position between personalities and abstract beings. Number three, wisdom is nothing more than a personification of a divine attribute. And number four, wisdom is a personification of cosmic order and is not thought of as a divine until a relatively late stage, namely the wisdom of Solomon, which, however, it remains uncertain whether a conceptually clear definition is achieved. If we are here to answer our question, what did it mean that the first Christians identified Christ as wisdom, we must attempt to reach some sort of decision as to which of these options is the best interpretation of these Old Testament and intertestamental passages. That is to say, which of these options best represents the meaning that the first Christians could read off from these passages. When we look more closely at the passages, several points become clear. First, if we set out the passages in the most likely chronological order, it becomes evident that there is both a development in the talk about wisdom, and that the development is due in large part to influence, positive and negative, from religious cults and philosophies prevalent in the ancient Near East at the time. So there is some crossover of thought, and that's going to be understandable. For example, Job 28. Surely there is a mine for silver, and a place for gold which they refine. But where shall wisdom be found? Here we cannot really speak of divine attributes or of personification. Wisdom may simply be the order given to the world by God. In Proverbs 8, wisdom speaks in the first person, clearly a personification at least. Moreover, the fact that wisdom is represented as a woman, attractive to young men, is best explained as due to the influence of the figure of Ishtar Astarte, the Mesopotamian goddess of love. That is to say, Proverbs 1, verse 20 to 33, 8, verse 1 to 35, and 9, verse 1 to 6, probably constitutes the author's attempt to counteract the influence of the Astarte cult by representing wisdom as much more attractive than the strange woman against whom he warns in chapters 2, 5, 6, and 7. And I would agree with him here. Some of this use is polemical. because they were counteracting the cults of the day. So here, wisdom is represented then as a woman, as opposed to the strange woman. More attractive to many scholars is the thesis that Proverbs 8, verse 22 to 31, and more clearly Sirach 24, has been generally influenced by the cult of Isis from Egypt. The chief point of comparison is that Isis proclaims herself as a divine agent who created and sustains the universe, as a teacher who has revealed to men the principles of morality and the laws and arts of civilization. We know of at least one hymn in the first person to this effect, which circulated widely throughout the empire of the Ptolemies, probably as early as the 3rd century before Christ. So it's a possibility, but I'm going to show you some of my discoveries on Proverbs 8. It's very, very interesting. With the wisdom of Solomon, the divine status of wisdom and her role in creation comes to clearest expression. Wisdom, the fashioner of all things. She reaches mightily from one end of the earth to the other, and she orders all things well. Wisdom, who sits beside God's throne. Most striking of all is the influence of Stoic thought about cosmic reason, the logos that pervades all creation, most clearly seen in the long description of wisdom in chapter 7, verse 22. Intelligent, holy, unique, manifold, subtle, mobile, for wisdom is more mobile than any motion. Because of her pureness, she pervades and penetrates all things, for she is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Finally, in the case of Philo, the influence of both Platonic and Stoic thought is clearly evident. More disputed is the question of Philo's dependence on the Isis myth. We can see in this quite frequent description of wisdom as mother of all things, and he gives a load of quotes, a possible allusion, and his characterization of wisdom as of many names. And he gives another quote to one of Philo's works. It's easy to parallel with Isis, the mirrored named, and he quotes Plutarch, etc. Though whether we should speak of dependence specifically on the Isis myth is much less clear. So there's no clear-cut answer to this. We may conclude, however, that deeply rooted in Palestinian soil and Jewish faith was the late Israelite talk of wisdom. Many of the images and words used to describe her were drawn from wider religious thought and worship, the aim being to present the worshippers of Yahweh with as an attractive as possible alternative to the cults and speculations more widely prevalent at their time. Now, I can agree with that. I think that's exactly what happened. They used the terminology and the mythology of the day they demythologized it and reframed it. And I think that's what often happens. Second, we should bear in mind that language which denoted a hypostasis or independent deity in polytheism would certainly have a different connotation within a monotheistic religion, where a polytheistic faith would have little difficulty in counting wisdom as one more God within the heavenly pantheon. A monotheistic faith could make no such accommodation. However much some Jews might be willing to diffuse their monotheism under the impact of Hellenistic culture, there is no clear evidence that the wisdom tradition we have been examining ever did so. And I would agree with that there is no evidence that this is talking about another God. It is, as he says, it is the influence probably of Hellenistic culture and other cultures, but it isn't the elevation of wisdom to godlike status. It is personification or hypostasis or whatever. This is why we cannot simply abstract statements and words out of the context of, for example, an Isis hymn on the one hand and Ben Sira on the other, and interpret them as equivalents. One of the mistakes too often made by the history of religious schools, and I see this a lot. I see this a lot, that they're in the history of religious schools, and people saying, "Ah, yes, well, you can find this in Canaanite religion, or you can find this in this is how they used to worship Baal, or this is what the Greeks did, or this is what So therefore, it must be equivalent. It must mean exactly the same thing. No, it doesn't. It's a different context. It's been reframed. It doesn't mean the same thing. Like us celebrating Christmas, there's pagan elements in the Christmas celebration, but it's been completely reframed. Doesn't mean the same as it did to people doing certain pagan rituals 2,000 years ago. Most people wouldn't even know. Same sort of thing. So what he goes on to say is that it's precisely, he says, in order to understand what meaning such words and statements had for those who used them, we must interpret them within the context in which they were used. Thus, when Ringeren examines the hypostatisation of divine qualities and functions in the ancient Near East, the classic study in this field, he concludes that the words like ma'at, which is the Egyptian word for truth, righteousness, order, and regularity in the cosmos. Now that's an interesting word, just by the side. Maat, because I'm a Dutch speaker, and it has to do with measuring in Dutch. And that comes, you can see the word maat comes from Egypt. It's about cosmic order, measuring, or judging something. Words like maat, truth, righteousness, order, regularity in the cosmos, and Masaru, righteousness, come to denote independent deities in Egypt. Maat, originally a function of the high god in Egyptian religion, becomes a self-existent being. And since the word Maat is female, it was natural that this being should become a goddess and the daughter of the god. So we see that what they did was they took attributes and qualities, and they elevated these qualities to godlike status. They became gods in their own right. Maat became a female goddess in Egypt. Similarly with Masaru in the Babylonian pantheon. But what makes it clear to Ringeren that these are more than merely poetic personifications or abstractions is that we know of many priests of Maat. We know that Mesaru had his own image in the temple and was worshipped there. This is precisely what is lacking in the wisdom tradition used by Proverbs, Ben Sira, etc. So in pre-Christian, pre-Judaism times, the wisdom tradition in Israel didn't turn wisdom into a god, didn't have priests or idols that depicted wisdom, and didn't worship it, which is in complete contrast to what the Babylonians and the Egyptians did. That is to say, when set within the context of faith in Yahweh, there is no clear indication that wisdom language of these writings had gone beyond vivid personification. And then he goes on to say, so too, Ben Sira does not make use of or allusion to the hymns of the Isis cult in order to present wisdom as a figure like Isis in all respects. On the contrary, his purpose is quite clearly to identify wisdom with the law, as he says explicitly, all this is the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law which Moses commanded us as an inheritance for the congregation of Jacob. It fills men with wisdom like the Pishon, that's a river. Evidently, that Ben Sira is saying, in effect, that those attracted by the Isis cult, this wisdom, this cosmic order, which you see expressed in the figure of Isis and seek for in her cult, we most certainly, most definitively express in the Torah. And similar passages can be found in the book of Baruch and the wisdom writings. And it goes on, but I think you get the idea. And even Jesus quotes some of this wisdom literature, if I can find it. I don't know if it's here, but I highly recommend this book by James Dunn. It's a big book, but Christology in the Making. I'm going to read another section later on.